Chronicles. I've known Joe since 2015. He came to us for a research institute with an idea then that was a good idea, and he went away, and now he's back, and it's an even better idea. I'm going to introduce him in the context of two books. Anybody ever seen this book? It was produced in 1975 by the Office of Energy Policy in the state of Oregon. It is a way for the state of Oregon to go to essentially being an independent bioregion. It wasn't called that then, but that was it. That was 1975, and the result of that was it a hit? Or was it boom, nothing happened? Okay. But there is something in there that I want to read you because I think it helps. This is by Edna St. Vincent Millay. Upon this gifted age, in its dark hour, rains from the sky a meteoric shower of facts. They lie unquestioned, uncombined, wisdom enough to leach us of all our ill is daily spun, but there exists no loom to weave it into fabric. And that's exactly what happened here. There was no loom to weave it into fabric. Almost 50 years later, here's a book called The Design Pathway for Regenerating Earth, written by my friend, the polymath Joe Brewer. And I'm going to read you what I said to my friends. I bought 50 copies of this, sent them around to everybody I think might be able to use it. As the species continues to exacerbate planetary collapse, the Design Pathway for Regenerating Earth by the polymath Joe Brewer offers a framework for addressing the problems we face. The design pathway espoused in the book uses long-term bioregional repair at all levels of scale to bring planetary boundary conditions back to those necessary for our survival. The book is well written, but it is hard emotionally and intellectually. This is due to both the scope of its analysis and the difficulty of comprehending the future before us. Joe has brought some clarity to this. The bioregional approach, I think, is the only game in town, and Joe will tell you about it. Thank you very much.
It's a great book.
My pleasure.
Well, I got to say, it's really an honor to be introduced by Sean. All of you who know him know that he is a very special person. I want to start tonight by holding a little bit of a focus and like a meditative intention around time. Some of you may have given up waiting for the conversation we're about to have. Some of you may have decided it's never going to happen. I've actually decided that several times myself. Because when you face the immensity of the crisis that we're in, it's important to give up a few times, so you don't carry too much. So I want to begin with another comment that I say in a lot of my talks, which is that I only really have one claim to legitimacy here, only one claim to credibility. I mean, yes, I'm trained in Earth system science. Yes, I'm trained in cognitive and behavioral science. Yes, I'm trained in cultural evolution. So I could speak in a sort of academic expert way, but I actually feel that that's not where my legitimacy comes from. My legitimacy comes from being the father of a 6.5-year-old little girl. Because with everything we're going to talk about today, you'll see that I have an understanding of the state of the planet, the level of risk, and the fear that is properly invoked by thinking about the future. And I chose with eyes wide open to have a child. It was a long 10-year struggle within myself to decide whether I would ever have children, whether it would even be a good idea to have children with what was coming. And somewhere inside of me, two things came through. One was, I am not complete in myself until I become a father. For those of you who are parents, you know what I'm talking about. The other thing was that I wanted to take a principled stance that a bit of a narcissist but rather bright guy named Nassim Taleb likes to say, which is that people who like to invest money when dealing with complex systems can make really stupid decisions if they don't put any skin in the game. But if it's your own money, then maybe you'll pay a little bit more attention to the risks and you try and make better investments. Well, I decided to put skin in the game. My skin is wrapped around the body of a child. So that's my legitimacy for being here. What I want to talk to you about tonight is a really important topic. It's what do we do to avoid human extinction? It's what do we do to make it possible for humans to reintegrate and find harmony again with the rest of life on Earth. Now, to do that, we're going to have a rather focused conversation. And so the focused conversation can be found in these words. So I want to walk you through the title. Because, you know, when we pick our titles for talks, there should be a good reason for the choice of words. And I want to start with this word, how. This is not a conversation about do we regenerate Cascadia. It's how do we do this? What does that actually take? Can it be done? If it could be done, how would we do it? So we're going to talk about that. The other one is this word regenerate, because regenerate from regeneration is not one of those buzzwords that can be greenwashed away like sustainability has been or like environment has been. Right? Isn't this a nice social environment? See, these words can be used by different meanings. But regeneration, no matter what kind of greenwashing is done to it, and trust me, a lot's already being done, in its core, regeneration is the dynamic pattern of life for any living being. It's reproducing moment to moment the conditions conducive to life. The dynamic pattern, sometimes technically called autopoiesis, which is the self-created context of self-expression, which is what life is. We express ourselves into being moment to moment. That is regeneration. So to regenerate Cascadia means we have to understand, how does life work here? What are those processes? What are those dynamics? What is already alive? And how do we work with it? And then there's the word Cascadia. Cascadia is one of those words. My friend Brandon, who's back in the back, I think is an expert in the history of this word. Because Cascadia is a word that's been attributed to a social movement to step away from the United States and Canada and organize a regional scale economic system and social identity that could replace the present day nation states. Cascadia as the secessionist movement, as the independence movement, as the movement away from colonization, as the movement away from capitalism or globalization. Pick your flavor. Cascadia has been an ongoing set of conversations about how a region that has a very clear ecological identity and a very strong cultural cohesion could actually exist and manage itself and govern itself for its own well-being. And so Cascadia, as you can see on this map, this is a map of Cascadia, that it's a very large area, principally defined by three organizing patterns: the Cascade Mountain Range, the drainages of the Salish Sea, and the drainages of the Columbia River Basin. And by these three principal patterns, you organize into a coherent system of landscapes. So we're going to talk about regenerating Cascadia, which is we're going to talk about regeneration at the scales that are needed. We're not going to talk about regeneration at the scales that are nice, but aren't going to get us where we need to go. So that's the focus. That's the intention. How do we regenerate Cascadia? To begin the conversation, I want to remind us of something that many have said before, which is if you look at the Earth from space, like you can see in this image here, you'll notice the absence of political boundaries, right? you'll see that this is a holistic and integrated dynamic system, continually evolving, continually changing, and highly complex. I like to look at the way the water moves. Just look at the water. Ocean covering 71% of the land surface. But even on the land, on the continents, there are lakes and oceans, or there are lakes and seas and rivers. There's surface water. But there's also ice. There are glaciers and ice sheets. And then in the air, there's water vapor, and there are clouds, and there's precipitation. So is there anywhere in this image that there's not any water? The water connects all of it. The water goes everywhere in this image. And this integration of the earth creates a kind of interdependence, which creates a kind of systemic fragility or systemic risk, where risks emerge through the interactions of the parts. And we need to understand how that works to see how to get to systemic resilience. So when we start with the understanding that the entire Earth is an integrated dynamic whole, then we can begin talking about how to manage, how to dance with, how to collaborate with this incredible creativity that is always changing and evolving. To talk about regenerating the Earth, we need to have a shared understanding of where we are. Because if you look at something like the public policy discourse on climate change, you'll see the entire conversation is about a particular molecule, carbon dioxide, its concentration in the atmosphere, principally as it relates to changes in surface temperatures 2 meters above the ground. And you'll see a lot of techno-fix solutions for how to deal with that carbon dioxide molecule. And you won't see the systemic whole that is the Earth. So the way that I like to talk about where we are in the state of the world is with a framework called planetary boundaries. So just by a show of hands, who has heard of planetary boundaries? So a little bit more than half of you. So I want to walk through the planetary boundaries because even if we've heard of them, a lot of us don't really understand fully what they are. So the planetary boundaries framework comes from an organization called Stockholm Resilience Center. And in 2009, so about almost 15 years ago, a really important question came up. Stockholm Resilience Center is a collaboration of researchers who study the dynamic Earth, atmospheric scientists, oceanographers, people who study atmospheric chemistry, that study weather patterns, people who study the dynamic Earth. There are about 3,500 researchers in the community associated with the Stockholm Resilience Center. And a group of these researchers came together in 2009 and asked a very interesting question. They said, with everything we know about the dynamic Earth, are there any thresholds that if we crossed that threshold, we would leave a safe operating space for humanity and our ability to have a globalized civilization as we've had with long-term stable climate, with large-scale agriculture, with long-standing urban settlements? If we were to move beyond some critical thresholds where it would no longer be possible to have that level of stability and our globalized society would go away. So they asked this question, are there any boundaries based on what we know? And the answer came out that there are 9. So I just want to walk through them really quickly. Climate change is only one of the 9. So we talk a lot about climate change, but it's only one of them. Another is biosphere integrity. Biosphere integrity is a measure of the rate of extinction for species and the resilience of ecosystems that depend on biodiversity. So if you cause extinctions to happen too quickly, the ecosystems unravel and collapse. And if we have too fast of a rate of extinction, then we destabilize the whole planet. This is the measure of our mass extinction event that's occurring. Then the third one is land system change. Land system change means that you take intact, healthy ecosystems and you degrade them. Maybe you cut down forests for industrial uses, or you replace forests with agriculture, or you replace them with urban landscapes. And these degraded landscapes are land system change. And if you degrade too many ecosystems and too much of the land surface of the planet is degraded, then it collapses the whole biosphere. Another one is freshwater use. Only 1% of the available water on Earth is in freshwater form, most of it's saltwater. And that fresh water, if it becomes too contaminated, and if it doesn't flow in the right ways, we can't maintain a globalized society. Biogeochemical flows is the measure of reactive nitrogen and phosphorus associated with synthetic fertilizers and industrial agriculture. And when it runs off of those fields into our rivers and into the ocean, it creates huge apoxic zones, which is that they cause algae to bloom, which consumes all of the oxygen, and then it kills the ecosystems in the world ocean. And so if there's too much biogeochemical flow, it can cause the marine ecosystems and the base of the food chain to collapse. Then there's ocean acidification. Notice that ocean acidification is affected by climate change and vice versa, which is to say that these things are not separate from each other. If you have too much acidity of the ocean, calcium carbonate begins to dissolve in the ocean, and then you have no more coral reefs, and you have no more shells, and you have no more bony structures for any animals in the world ocean. Atmospheric aerosol loading is just a fancy way of saying air pollution. If there's too much air pollution, it can destabilize our weather systems, or it can cause respiratory problems in land-based animals, so on and so forth. Then there's stratospheric ozone depletion, which is that in the stratosphere there's a layer of ozone which absorbs the ultraviolet radiation from the sun, protecting all land-based life from cancer or from other tissue harms due to ultraviolet radiation. And then the last one is novel entities. Novel entities are any chemical created by humans that the Earth doesn't know how to deal with. It's like, wow, okay, they identified 9. And remember what I said at the beginning. These are thresholds that if you cross even one, the idea of having a globalized civilization is called into question, and the possibilities of having large-scale agriculture, large-scale population centers, all these things are called into question. So there's a really obvious question that follows, right? We found that there are 9. How are we doing? Have we crossed any? So in 2009, they created this framework. In 2015, they had their first results, and they published them, and they said, we've crossed 4. We'd already crossed these 4: climate change, biosphere integrity, land system change, and biogeochemical flows. That doesn't mean we crossed them in 2015. That means the research was conclusive that we'd crossed them. But then the research continues, and as is the case with peer review research, there are time delays, a couple of years, before the research are really solid and have their debates and discussions and look at new data. So in 2021, they added freshwater use and ocean acidification. So we'd already crossed these. And then in 2022, microplastics. Microplastics are in every drop of breast milk of every woman on Earth. It's in every water supply on Earth, in all of our aquifers. Microplastics, which can be hormone-disrupting molecules, are in the entire water supply of the planet. And so when we look at this and say, so are we going to avoid abrupt climate change by getting below 350 parts per million CO2 by 2030? See where the discourse is? It's absolutely absurd. The reality is that we are already midway into planetary collapse, and the Earth is cascading through destabilization, breakdown, and a massive transition. And we're already in it. Another way of thinking about this is in the research on tipping points of the Earth system. Now, I'm not going to go through this whole graphic, but this is a summary of the major tipping points of the Earth. I'll just show you a couple of them. The boreal forest, which is the world's largest forest, which makes a band around the Arctic Circle in the northern hemisphere. If there's a dieback of the boreal forest, like did anyone notice the wildfires this year in North America? Think that's not going to accelerate the dieback of the boreal forest? The Amazon rainforest, which is on schedule to collapse and permanently become grassland savanna 2024, 2025 due to deforestation. The melting of the Greenland ice sheet, the shutdown of the Atlantic Ocean circulation that forms deep water and creates temperate climate across Europe. The melting or the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet, instantly causing several meters of sea level rise. And you start to see that those planetary boundaries are defined in a way that they're to avoid these tipping points being crossed. Now, what's interesting about these tipping points is that if one of them is crossed, it actually speeds us up to crossing others because they're all interdependent. I'm going to give a little example of this. Here's one of those tipping points. If you have global warming, or if you have the atmosphere getting warmer, and the warming is amplified in the Arctic, meaning at high latitudes, it's warmer than at the equator, then this will cause a reduction in Arctic sea ice, the ice that's in the Arctic Ocean in the northern hemisphere summer. If there's less sea ice, you replace an ice surface that reflects 90% of sunlight into space with an open water surface that absorbs 90% of sunlight. And this causes the ocean to absorb more heat, which causes more atmospheric warming, which is a self-reinforcing or accelerating process. So what happens when there's no longer ice in the Arctic Ocean? Which is on schedule to happen sometime between roughly now and 2030. We're getting close. If you look year by year, there's less Arctic sea ice each year, and all you need is one extreme heat event, and there's a shift. Well, what happens when all of that warming occurs in the Arctic Ocean? This right here is the jet stream. The jet stream is what guides our weather patterns. And for those of you in this region, you might recognize this pattern that's shaped like the capital Omega, because that's the pattern that causes your rainy season in the Northwest. The characteristic feature of Cascadia is this two-season cycle of a dry season and a wet season, and when that pattern is set up, you get rain. So what happens when the mixing of heat in the Arctic is dramatically shifted? It causes all of the jet streams to move, which changes the pathway for the weather, which creates turbulence and chaos in the weather systems. What does that do to agriculture? Everywhere on Earth. And then you start to see the systemic instabilities and the systemic risk. So the takeaway from this is that the Earth is a whole system, and it's got cascading consequences. Cascading consequences with time delays. One part of the system has changed, it causes a change in another, but they could be delayed by years or decades or centuries. And so, when breakdown unfolds across space and time, we start to see how the Earth really works. We see that all the different parts of the Earth are interdependent with each other. And this is where I introduce the silver lining. The silver lining to this story is look at how much we know about the Earth. Look how good our Earth system's knowledge is getting. Look how good we're getting at seeing these relationships. Which means, if there are interdependencies from one part of the Earth to another, and they create systemic risk, then we can work with those patterns across multiple places to build up systemic resilience. And this is the only way. This is what we have to do. So, I've traveled around the world a lot. I visit a lot of regenerative projects. And what I've noticed is all of them, without exception, take place on a plot of land. For example, we were at Jan's beautiful permaculture project, 23 years of a suburban home defined by a plot of land. So I've been to lots of permaculture projects. I've been to urban farms. I've been to reforestation projects. I've been to conservation projects. And all of them are bounded by some definition of a plot of land. So what's interesting about this is that every plot of land is embedded in something larger, a set of ecological connections. For example, you might be on a piece of land like a permaculture center that's in a watershed. And water from upstream flows across the land and flows downstream. So if there's someone upstream from you dumping pollutants into the water, they'll flow across your land. There are ecological connections. Now what's interesting about these ecological connections is that they're already organized as holistic landscapes, such as watersheds, coastal estuaries, local precipitation patterns and weather systems. Right? They actually are already organized as holistic landscapes. And those holistic landscapes are embedded within larger planetary processes. such as the jet stream that brings moisture from the Pacific Ocean to bring rain to the Cascade Mountains during the winter here. Now, when I look at these 4 levels, and I ask myself, where is the place that I should intervene to restore resilience to the planet? The answer is none of them. It doesn't work at any level. But if you shift your thinking ever so slightly, you start to see the secret is to look between the levels. You start to notice what happens as you move across levels. What happens if you have a plot of land that is ecologically connected to other plots of land in the same larger landscape? And then you start to see the nestedness of reality. You start to see that reality is inherently nested across levels. And that the way to restore resilience to the planet is to work across scales. So that's what we're going to explore about how to regenerate Cascadia. So there's another little thing about this work that is so powerful that it's honestly quite surprising, which is a very simple factual statement. Everything that happens anywhere on Earth happens somewhere. Happens somewhere. And that's so simple to say. It's just sort of true. Of course, something happens somewhere. But here's the interesting thing, is there is a transformational power to focusing on place. So here's North America. Where are we? Right there, right? We're in a place. We're in a place within the dynamic Earth. And so if we start to see how place organizes itself, then we start to see how to work with the living patterns of place. Place is really interesting because place brings a lot with it. For example, every place on Earth has a unique geologic history for that place. Every place on Earth has a rich ecological history of the kinds of climate systems, the kinds of soils, the kinds of ecology that are inherent to that place. And if humans have lived in the place, there's a specific cultural history for that place. Who are the ancestral people of this place? How did they live here? Were their cultures sustainable? If they were sustainable, how did they do it? And when you put these 3 histories together, you start to see a coherent story of place, where you're in a place that formed as part of the Earth with particular kinds of life expressed and particular cultural ways of living for the human presence. And this story of place is not static, and it's also not finished. It's happening now. We are storying our place. We are all part of the story of this place right now. We're part of the story of this place. And so as you start to construct a story of your place, you arrive at whole system understandings of that place. How does this place work? How did it come to be? What kind of life naturally exists and flourishes here? How do I work with and find harmony with that life? And these whole system understandings enable the people living in a... Does this story have a future? Or does this story not have a future? Every place is embellishing and embodying the richness of its geological, ecological, and cultural history and its possible futures. And so the way to begin to organize a place is to come to know the place and to learn how to belong to the place. And then guardian and steward and care for the future of the place. This might start to sound like indigenous livelihoods. That's not an accident. So let's look at an example of this. This is an image I took from Google Earth. This is Springfield, Eugene. North is that way in this image. And I want you to notice the patterns of degradation. Where has the land been damaged? It's really obvious. It's in the valleys. It's in the valleys where they have the agriculture, where they've cut down the trees. So if you look at the land in this way and you say, how might we organize the regeneration of this landscape? My daughter with crayons could draw it. It would look like this. Right? The landscape already tells us how to organize. The landscape says, reconnect the valleys and restore the rivers. and connect them to the plains. What's interesting about this is if you look at this scale here, this might be about 10 miles from one end to another, maybe 2 or 3 miles across. This is a human scale. This is a scale that you could imagine managing together with other people. You could imagine going to about 100 private landowners and having conversations with them about how to restore their valley, about what kind of economy they want to have, about what kind of connectivity is needed for the wildlife. This is a human scale. This is a human scale for organizing. There are ecological restoration projects at this scale. There are lots of them. So what's interesting is the land tells you how to restore its health and well-being. And what's interesting about this is that there are those nested levels of reality. So if we start to zoom out, here's the Willamette Valley. Now north is this way. So there's Portland on this end, Eugene on that end. Look how degraded that is. Look how deforested it is. This is like a third of Oregon. When you look at this and go, wow, that's so big, how would we ever regenerate that? And the answer is the same way we looked at the previous picture. You see these different drainages and places that are more degraded, and you organize each of them on the human scale. See, here are the 3 of them that I showed you before in the previous image. And so if I go back, see that here we are in Eugene, and we can start regenerating these valleys. And if we go out to the Willamette Valley, which is much bigger, maybe we have 50 or 100 of those projects happening in parallel. And then we start to see that it's really about organizing locally with a larger vision of what we're doing to move toward the larger scale. Now let's go out one more level and look at the Columbia River Basin. 258,000 square miles, the same size as the drainage of the entire Colorado River. And you look here, there's the Willamette Valley. It's right there. And you start to see that we could organize these little projects all throughout the Willamette Valley, but we could do it anywhere else in this basin as well. And now we start to see how to regenerate an entire watershed, an entire hydrological system. The Columbia River has 174 rivers that drain into it. So imagine 174 watershed restoration projects. This isn't that hard to do. This is very real. This can be done. And you start to see the pattern, and the pattern is this. We organize local landscapes embedded within larger land systems. Now imagine a mycelial web of this kind of regeneration spreading across Cascadia. Now those of you who have been involved in political struggle might notice that this is presuming that there's a collapse of the globalized system, that the current corrupt politics probably goes away. Notice that this is not a short-term vision. This is the next 200 to 500 years, if humans don't go extinct. But imagine, here we are doing a Regenerate Cascadia tour. We're traveling around. And let's say we visited all of these places. And in each of these places, people start organizing their local landscapes and learning from each other. And then other people, a little bit further away, like say these people down here, they get wind of it and they start organizing themselves too. And you start to see how we could regenerate the entire Columbia Basin. The logic to this is so obvious when you look at the maps and just think in this way, when you look through the obstacles of our dying civilization. And you ask, what's going to come next? What's going to come next is one of two things: human extinction, or we do this. Because either we regenerate landscapes and find a way to survive, or we go the way of the dodo. And so this is really it. But it's a long-term game. Now, to be able to do this work, it helps to know, how do you structure these regenerative processes? How do you organize them? How do you make this happen for real? Remember that word, how. It's not just that you organize around landscapes. What do you organize around landscapes? So let's go back and see that once again, it's organized by the land. The landscape tells us what to do. So imagine within a watershed or within the entire bioregion that we create bioregional learning centers. Places where we learn the geologic, ecological, and cultural history of place. and we learn the living processes of the place, and we learn the healthy patterns of economic activity for the place. For example, do we gather native seeds? Do we grow textiles from native plants for our clothing? Or do we have robust and healthy forests for hunting deer and elk to make clothing from their furs? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So we need bioregional learning centers. We need to organize education around how to live in place. Then we need to cultivate territorial governance. Because if we don't figure out how to set priorities, make decisions, mobilize resources, allocate resources in service to our landscapes, we're not going to govern, we're not going to do very much. So we have to build territorial governance. And what's beautiful is that we can do this by weaving tapestries of local projects and weaving ecosystems of learning with existing educational offerings. Right now we're in Dharmalya and the Proud Institute. This is a bioregional learning space. Yesterday we were at Lost Valley. Yesterday we were at Jan's house. These are bioregional learning spaces. There are lots of them. It's how do we organize them that matters. And we do all of this with a foundational approach of designing pro-social contexts, which is to say, we need to create shared identity and purpose. We have to have equitable distribution of contributions and benefits. We need fair and inclusive decision-making. We need fast and fair conflict resolution. The kinds of things that enable us to engage socially together in generous, altruistic, and cooperative ways. So we have to design for the management of commons. We have to design for shared purpose and shared impact. For example, do we want salmon in this river? It's a good example of a shared purpose. How do you organize around the shared purpose of bringing salmon back to a river? Well, you gather knowledge, you talk to people. It actually organizes itself with its own logic, which is that the purpose actually tells you a lot about what to do. So the design of pro-social context is fundamental to this work. Now, before moving any further, I want to stop and be sure we all understand what a bioregion is. Because bioregions are it's an idea that was born in a time of political revolution and political change. So there are political definitions of bioregions. And actually, one of the reasons that the bioregionalism movement grew for a couple of decades and then broke apart was political arguments about the boundaries of bioregions and how to define them. So I want to go one level deeper and one level more basic. A bioregion is simply the putting together of two longer words into one word. A bioregion is a biological region, shortened to the word bioregion. So what is a biological region? It is the spatial geography in which the entire life system exists for a population of a species. Which is to say, it is the biological geography of life for a species, for their population. I'll give a non-human example. Starfish. What is the bioregion where there are tide pools? You'll see there's high tide and there's low tide, and the starfish exists in the space between. They get all of their food, right? They get their shelter, they're able to reproduce. The entire population of starfish exists within the intertidal zone. So their geography or their bioregion is really easy to define. When you get to a human bioregion, it gets a lot more complicated. Because a human bioregion depends on cultural identity, political organization, social organization, the type of technology, which can affect how the economy is organized. Right? So a human bioregion includes this strong cultural dimension, which makes it much more complex and much more open to be contested, which is to say there is a political discourse around bioregions for humans that is very, very important. No outsider can ever tell you what your bioregion is. There needs to be sovereignty of definition. There needs to be governance and political identity for a bioregion. So this is what a bioregion is. It's the whole life context geographically defined. So if that's what a bioregion is, that means each bioregion is actually a whole system for life that can be a model for how that life is healthy. which means we can start to imagine the entire planet organized as bioregions. We can start imagining learning exchanges between bioregions. We can imagine humans reorganizing our societies as bioregions, which is to reorganize our societies as holistic living systems that are in harmony with their place. Now that should sound a lot like indigenous culture, because it's not an accident. So one of the things we're doing is working to build a planetary network of projects, places where people are learning to live as bioregions. So this is what needs to happen. We need to recreate the conditions, because we've damaged and degraded them. We've moved away from them. We have to recreate the conditions for living locally in terms of material flows, integrated life systems, and the thriving of families and communities. What I love about this map is that this is a map of ecozones or ecoregions. Each color designates a different kinds of ecosystem based on soil type, climate, and the ecosystem that's there. What matters when you look at this map is not what the colors indicate, but just notice that there's a diversity of them, which means we should expect there to be a diversity of human cultures and a diversity of human economies, each one organized appropriately to the type of ecosystem for its place. So there was this famous study back in 1972. It really shook things up. It was a study called Limits to Growth, which was a computer simulation of resource flows in the global economy. One of their scenarios was called business as usual, which is where that phrase comes from. And that scenario has been tracked by reality with rather disturbing accuracy, showing that the human population is about to start going down pretty quick, starting sometime around 2030, and really peaking around 2040, and then dropping rapidly afterwards. Well, this research study, led by a group at MIT, created a real firestorm of controversy, but it also caused a group of thinkers to organize that called themselves the Balaton Group, because they were thinkers who gathered at Lake Balaton in Hungary and started having conversations. People like Dana Meadows and Amory Lovins and others who were involved. These are the great sustainability thinkers of their day. And this Balaton Group spent 10 years having meetings all around the world, trying to figure out how do we live on a finite planet. After 10 years, a short essay was written by Dana Meadows, the lead author of the Limits to Growth study, called A Brief History of the Balaton Group. Just a little essay she wrote. One of her friends, Isabel Carlisle, has started spreading this essay around again, which is how I got a copy a couple years ago. And this is a quote from that essay, which was written in 1983. This is from Vernon Rutten, who is an agroeconomist who is a member of the Balaton Group. He said this: each agroeconomic region is so unique that the concept of transfer of technology is irrelevant. What's relevant is the transfer of the capacity to develop technology and institutions that are consistent with the cultural endowment and the resource endowment of each region, which is each place needs to learn how to build its own capacities to manage itself. And then Dana Meadows said this: out of this 10 years of conversations came a vision of a number of centers where information and models about resources and the environment are housed. There would need to be many of these centers all over the world, each one responsible for a distinct bioregion. So in 1983, the best thinkers in the world looking at sustainability issues said the only way to get to planetary sustainability is to reorganize human life around bioregions as local living economies, and for each bioregion to have at least one bioregional learning center. So have there been any ideas since 1983 about how to get to planetary sustainability that are better than this one? And the answer is no. No, not at all, because this is the only way. It's the only way. So in 1983, I was 6 years old. So for 40 years, the best chance we have to get to planetary sustainability has been largely unknown and forgotten to the world. Instead, we talk about changing our light bulbs or replacing the internal combustion engine of our single occupancy vehicles with an electric motor in our single occupancy vehicles, where the batteries come from scraping the ocean floor and mountaintop removal and extensive mining for lithium, which is an absolutely absurd get-rich scheme for psychopathic billionaires. Doesn't really do much of anything for the environment. And so the quality of our discourse has diminished greatly since the early 1980s. For those of you who remember when population used to be part of the environmental discourse, when consumption used to be part of the environmental discourse. Now it's all about carbon dioxide molecules and consumer products. And so, I know it's really pathetic because it's like you either laugh or cry how bad it's gotten. But this is it. This is the only game in town, to quote Sean Bowles. He's like, this is the only game in town. Yes. It's to create bioregional economies, bioregional societies, bioregional cultures. So we're doing this where I live in Colombia. This is a map of the topography of Colombia in the northern Andes in South America. And I just want to show you a little bit about how we're doing it to make this concrete, because then you can start to see how you might do this here. And so where I live is in a place called Barichara, Colombia. It's right about here. And this region that's colored in is a well-defined regional climate system. It's about 500,000 hectares of land. And the reason it's a climate system is you have high mountains here, high mountains over here, and high mountains there. And they create this triangular enclosure. And the air comes in and circulates within a well-defined boundary, creating a well-contained climate system. And also a unique type of ecosystem. It's the only place on Earth that has the high Andes tropical dry forest, which is 80% endemic species, which means 8 out of 10 species exist nowhere else on Earth. And the forest is 95% deforested. And the whole region is becoming a desert. So let's look at it. That's Barichara. Its tourism slogan is the prettiest town in Colombia, which is probably true. It's absolutely beautiful there. This is a picture that I took from Bioparque Moncora, which is a community reforestation project where children in the community are regrowing native forest with elders of the community. I'm growing a food forest in Bioparque Moncora, have been for the last 3 years. And so you can get a little feel for this landscape. It's absolutely gorgeous, right in the heart of the northern Andes. And what happened when I arrived there in November 2019 was I started visiting different projects and seeing they were all fragmented and isolated from each other. They didn't even know about each other. And so what I started doing was creating learning processes for healing the entire landscape by bringing these projects into cooperation. And one of the ways of doing that was identifying where they exist in the landscape and how they might thematically relate to each other, and then helping build trust between the leaders of the different projects. And then also going out into the world and doing crowdfunding and mobilizing resources to support their projects. We did this with 4 key patterns. And it's okay if this is hard to read because I can summarize it. So these are 4 key territorial scale patterns that we're working with to regenerate our bioregion. One of them is the restoration of entire watersheds, because in Barichara, all of the rivers are dead. They're dead. They've either dried up and there's no water at all, or when it rains, it just runs off with massive erosion, or they're so contaminated that nothing can live in them. All of the rivers in the region are dead. So the restoration of watersheds means setting up community water councils. It means restoring soils. It means reforestation. Right? It means engaging in activities at the watershed scale. We also set up a learning center in syntropic agroforestry, which is a very powerful kind of reforestation work that creates food forest systems optimized for becoming climax ecosystems, which means they grow through their stages of ecological succession to a mature forest in the fastest way possible, with intensive pruning and with selection of species so that there's no competition between plants, that they have syntropic, or they have cooperative and synergistic relationships. So we started setting up demonstration sites in syntropic agroforestry, bringing in teachers, giving workshops, and coordinating learning across the land of the participants of the workshops as they're practicing syntropic agroforestry, so that we can build a shared understanding of reforestation and an alternative economy. Because these agroforestry systems grow food, they grow textiles, they grow medicinal plants, right? They grow construction materials, all of the basic things you need for the material flows of a local economy. And then we have a focus on the transformation of local food systems. Barichara is very lucky in that about 70% of the food consumed in the town is grown within 10 kilometers of the town. Most places are lucky to get to 3%. Food sheds around the world are pathetically fragile. So we're doing pretty good. We're more than half of our food comes from a walking distance from the town. 10 kilometers means you could start in the morning with food on a backpack and walk into town to have it market and walk back home at the end of the day. So with no petroleum, you could have a sustainable food system. And so we're working on creating a food system by gathering the producers, the ones that are cultivating different crops, that have knowledge of different materials, that have the coffee plantations, but also grow other kinds of food, the gardeners, the ones with the biodigesters, and we're starting to bring them together to collaborate around the security and stability of a regional food system. And then the other thing we're doing is designing alternative economic models, which is creating trust and solidarity exchanges, creating community currencies, local marketplaces, different pricing structure for local people and for tourists, all kinds of ways of storing and moving value within the community that don't rely on global supply chains. And so just with these four, you can already start to see that there are patterns of integration that move to the scale of the entire landscape, that can be organized and networked across the entire landscape. There are actually more patterns than these, but these four already show you how you can think about this and how you can do this here, and how much of it's probably already being done here to some extent. Another thing that we do is we think very differently about education, because education touches everything in regenerative work. There's no part of regenerative work that's not education. We're learning all the time. We're teaching each other all the time. There are all kinds of things we're doing. This is an example of something we're doing in Barichara, where this person here in the middle is Felipe, started a project called Pasos de Agua, which translates as the steps of water, the path that water walks. And he would do water walks, caminatas del agua, where he would take children between the age of 4 and 10, and they would walk the parts of the watershed for the dead river of the Barichara River. And they would get permission to walk across the land of the private landowners, and the children would interview the adults and ask them what happened to the water, which of course would cause an outpouring of shame and grief and humiliation in the adults, as the adults would say, we cut down these trees, we destroyed these forests, we killed this water. The children are cultivating conscience in the adults. And as this happens, the children can be brought together with experts of various kinds, permaculture experts, experts in native plants, experts in watershed restoration, indigenous elders like this Muisca elder who came and visited the children to give them ethical guidance. And as these children are engaging in the work of leading the restoration of one of our main waterways, they start to suggest policies. This is Quetzal. She's now 7, but when this picture was taken, she was 6 years old. So Quetzal's 6 years old, and here she is presenting her ideas for how to restore the Barichara River. My favorite topic on that list was when she said, well, we could take bales of hay and wrap them up and inoculate them with mushrooms, and we could extract the contaminants from the water. Quetzal's 6, but she knows how to use YouTube. And so what's amazing is the children come up with great ideas because there's such great quality knowledge available to them, and because they are encouraged by the adults. Another thing that's happening is what you can see in this other picture. This is Gabriela and her granddaughter Soraya. We have a practice in Barichara that every time that there is an important conversation happening, if it's possible, we have the children play in the middle of the circle. Because we need the children to grow up knowing what the adults were talking about during these times. And we need the adults to hold themselves immediately and emotionally accountable to the children for every decision they make. And so one of our practices is to have the children in the middle of the conversations. And this creates an intergenerational dynamic that is incredibly powerful. Now, another thing that we started to notice as we're doing this work is you'll see things like, here's that Bioparque Moncora that I showed a picture of earlier. And right next to it is Fundación Montechico, where they take native plants and they focus on cultural preservation of knowledge for how to transform those plants into textiles and natural fibers. And they also do bioconstruction work. And they bring in experts and give workshops and teach the kids, mostly the middle schoolers, how to do bioconstruction and how to make natural fiber textiles. What's amazing is you could walk from here to there in 5 minutes. There's a little hiking trail. They didn't know about each other's work when I arrived.
Where's yours in context?
Well, we have a project way over here that's Origen del Agua. We have this land that we bought to put the Barichar Ecoversity, but the donor turned out to be a psychopath and is doing a land grab and stealing it back. So we don't know what's going to happen there. But we're doing a lot of restoration here. But there's a lot more than in this picture. But what's important to notice is that these two projects didn't talk to each other because Colombia had a period of time called La Violencia, where for almost 60 years, there was just homegrown terrorism and Colombians killed Colombians and it was a horrible thing and people were really afraid of each other and there was very low confidence or trust. So restoring the trust between people is a big part of the work in Colombia. And so what was amazing was the gringo from the outside could show up and say, wow, that's a great project. You all should talk. And start building trust among the locals. Reality has no shortage of ironies. But what's amazing is that when these projects start to sit next to each other and the leaders of the project start to collaborate with each other, we're able to do things like mobilize resources across a network of projects, which is something we've been doing for a couple of years. Interesting thing about this is if you look at the kinds of projects we work with, you don't need to know the names of all these projects, just that they're all different. This is Canae Colibri. It's a community theater where indigenous people create theatrical plays to teach the children conscience and mythology as it relates to the Northern Andean cosmovision and protection of nature. Kurasoma is a group of women who do work on trauma healing and violence, like domestic violence with women. And there are other projects like La Huerta Comunitaria, which is a network of families creating food security by growing food together. It's like a community garden. What matters here is that there are all these different kinds of projects. They all have different themes. And when I put them on a page like this, you have no idea how they relate to each other. It's like, how would you organize them? But when you put them on a map, you start to see things like, oh, Canae Colibri, which is over here, is connected to the same watershed for a project over here. And if we work on restoring the watershed, we can actually encourage theater productions about water that are related to the children that are learning how to map that waterway, that are connected to the regenerative agriculture projects that are doing reforestation in the same drainage, and we start to see how to organize the projects in a coherent way. The land tells us how to do it. And so that's what's so powerful about working at the landscape scale. And so, how do we organize bioregional learning? How is this different from the way we do it now? One thing about bioregional learning is it's about the coordination of learning processes. That if you create a bioregional learning center, it doesn't mean you even create any new educational offerings. You just create coordination among them. It's like, oh, let's identify all the educational processes for children to learn native plants. Or let's gather all of the ways that you could learn how to build healthy soils. Or whatever it may be, and you start to create coordination between them. Coordination between them becomes the role of the Bioregional Learning Center. You also have mapping and knowledge sharing. Now the mapping can be land mapping, it can be ecological mapping, but it can also be social system mapping. What kinds of knowledge do we have? What kinds of institutions do we have? Where are there possible sources of funding for this work? Whatever it may be, mapping and knowledge sharing is a big focus of what a bioregional learning center does, because again, it's coordinating the capacities. Also to have a gateway into community activities. Let's say an outsider shows up in Eugene and says, I want to get involved in the regeneration of your watersheds. Is there a single place that they could go? And they show up and say, what I'm really interested in is the emotional development of children. And you say, oh, you should come talk to these guys. And what I really care about is trees and reforestation and urban canopy. Oh, you should go talk to those guys. So to have a gateway, an entry portal for the education ecosystem is something that a bioregional learning center can do to help someone navigate it. Also, you can have advanced modeling and simulation, like we have at universities and research centers today. So if someone's going to do advanced computational modeling and scientific visualization of the change of canopy structure for the Central Cascades, the kind of information that's highly valuable for regenerative work, Right now, that is structured into our universities, our research centers, private or nonprofit research centers of many kinds. But a bioregional learning center can help to coordinate them and also to help apply the knowledge into community processes. Like, we need to create a scenario of future reforestation. Let's work with the computational modeling group at Oregon State, just as an example. Also, this is a place for gathering indigenous perspectives and focusing on the decolonization of knowledge and the decolonization of education, which is basically pervasive through this whole process. And it also is interesting that it's both centralized and decentralized. You have centralized components like, let's create a database of activities so that you can maintain decentralized autonomy of those activities and coordination between them. So these are some of the elements of a bioregional learning center. And you could probably look at this and see how some of this, I'm sure, is already happening. But imagine if there was an institutional focus on building, maintaining, and continually improving this for the entire bioregion, or for something like the Mackenzie River, something more local in scale. So that's a little flavor of bioregional learning. When you look at territorial governance, there's similar clarity about what it does. For one thing, territorial governance is about mapping and weaving local projects. Why is this governance? Because how do you map those local projects? You convene the people who have the projects, and you ask them questions about their projects. What are the things your projects could offer into a shared purpose? What are the things your projects need? How does this project relate to that project, and are there things they can do together? This is about governance. This is about making decisions. This is about coordination and setting priorities. And so that means that territorial governance is also about identifying needs and priorities, setting criteria. What is regenerative to us? If we want salmon in this river, maybe we need to take out that dam, or whatever it may be. And so identifying the needs, the priorities, the criteria is the work of governance. To form landscape partnerships, which is to say bring in different multi-stakeholder groups that have a common purpose and create coordination among them to achieve common goals. To create community funding structures, which is, we've got all the resources we need in our community, they're just very poorly allocated. How many billions of dollars have gone into extraction of knowledge at the University of Oregon by billionaires? Very poorly allocated resources, I would say. And so when we start creating community funding structures, what this means is we identify what we have that's valuable. There might be older people who have free time. Free time is valuable. Notice that these funding structures are not reducible to money. This is about anything of value. Knowledge sharing, tool sharing, time sharing, financial allocation. These are all related to governance. And if these are community funding structures, what that means is that they are accountable, that they are managed by the people who need them, that they get the feedbacks to the information that they need, and that they manage the corruptibility of their own processes, which means we practice subsidiarity, which is keep the decisions as close to where they need to be made as we can, where they're still effective, and only go up a level if we need to. It's called subsidiarity. Mobilize resources in service to the whole, which is just, right now what happens is, I need funding for my project, I'm going to get it for me because I need it. But how is my project in service to the whole? I don't know unless we map and identify needs and do these other things. I don't even know how they're in service to the whole, because the whole is a systemic view that's created by multiple people together. So mobilize resources in service to the whole comes from those whole system understandings. And this cultivates local sovereignty. This actually leads to, we are managing our own affairs, managing our own resources in service to our own future, locally defined. This is the antithesis of globalization, which is break down local sovereignty so an outsider can steal it and take it somewhere else, which is the basis of globalization. There are good things that came with globalization, but that's its economic and political basis. And this strengthens collaboration internally, which is cultivating capacity for governance. So as we think about organizing our landscapes, We need to organize our learning and the ways that we learn together, and we need to organize our ways of allocating resources and making decisions together. What's interesting is when you start to think this way, you start to see that there are really powerful tools available to us. This is a diagram or a schematic that shows how to create a landscape investment fund. So this was created by Common Land Foundation, which is an organization based in the Netherlands that works with large landscapes. Their definition is 100,000 hectares or larger. They're currently working with about 25 of these landscapes around the world. And they figured out two things. One is that most people who have money that might care about creating positive environmental or social impacts, that most people who have money are basically ecological idiots. They just don't know much about ecology. They don't know how to think about it. You talk to them about ecology, it's like, whew, they don't get it. So you have to simplify it and put it in a language they understand. Willem Verweerde, who's the founder of Common Land Foundation, used to be the director of IUCN, which is the Global Organization to Protect Biodiversity. He's an ecologist. He got tired of talking to funders who didn't understand ecology. So then the second thing that's in this is he realized that there already exist large-scale infrastructure projects. So think of like the light rail system around Portland. How much did that cost? $1 billion? I don't know, it's huge. When you look at these large-scale infrastructure projects, you start to see a couple of things. One is the price tag is not crazy. Like if you say, we need $500 million to restore this watershed, these are reasonable numbers for infrastructure projects. Also, infrastructure projects tend to last for 20 years or longer. If we're going to build a coal power plant, it needs to last for at least 30 years. Right? So infrastructure projects have these large time frames. Also, infrastructure projects require a core management team. Who handles hiring? Who takes care of legal issues? Who handles sourcing? Who is assessing the different parts of the project are happening at the time they need to? And this leads to a model for regenerating landscapes, which is that you have a 20-year time frame or longer, 100,000 hectares of land or larger. And what they found was that you need at least $2 million per year for each landscape to fund your core team, which is the group of people who are managing the process of restoring the landscape for 20 years or longer. Now just do the math. $2 million or more, 20 years or longer, you get to scales of $50 million to $100 million just for your core team for your landscape. And then they found that for the landscapes to regenerate it, you actually need what's called public goods infrastructure. Public goods infrastructure are investments in the public good that create general benefits to everyone that enable a healthy economy to form. An example is, it's hard to have a healthy economy without an educated population, so you invest in the public good of education. Right? So this is a way of thinking. So what they found was there are a lot of regenerative projects in a landscape, and they need to be funded to form ecosystems of action. And then what they found in practice is you typically need $5 to $10 million per year for each landscape to fund all of the regenerative projects and their integration. And then what they learned, because they've been doing this in practice, their biggest project is in Andalusia in a region of Spain. It's a 1 million hectare project that the Roman Empire completely destroyed with 5,000 years of agriculture. It's a desert now. What they found was that you don't start having functioning regenerative businesses that create financial returns until 8 to 10 years later. Because you have to create the integration and the patterns of relationships, the supply chain integration, and all the other things. So that means you're investing in public goods infrastructure for 8 to 10 years before you have viable businesses in this system. But once you start getting viable businesses, you get a tax base in which the local government starts to understand this model. And what they've also found in practice is that governments do not understand regenerative economic development. They do not fund it. And they wait until you have functioning regenerative economy to start reinvesting in policy structures that support it. And this is what they found in practice. And so what you can start to see here is that there is a framework for saying, let's raise $100 million to create a regenerative economy in the middle Willamette Valley. And that's a reasonable thing to do because that is a regenerative economic infrastructure project. And that you need to fund a core team of people to manage that process, and you need to fund key strategic processes and projects to build that regenerative economy. And what's amazing about this is that they're now doing this in 25 landscapes around the world. Some of them are more than 10 years old because they started in 2012, which is to say they're gathering the economic data and proving it out that this is a good investment. And people who want to make a positive impact with their money, because there's a lot of money floating around, there's more than $2 trillion waiting in the carbon markets to be put into carbon sequestration. And the reason that money cannot move is that there are legal protections on the investors. Think of like a pension retirement fund, where you have a legal requirement to protect the money because the money isn't yours. And you're managing the money on someone else's behalf. You have to create legal protection by managing risk, which means the money cannot move until there is enough organizing that you can grow to a scale that can manage the money. Like, is anyone in this room, if I was to give you $100 million today, would you be able to go out and create contracts and spend it all on reforestation projects here? The answer is no, because it's not organized. But if you start building the infrastructure and capacity, you'll be able to mobilize those kinds of resources. Look at how much money is used just to maintain highways in Eugene each year. And you'll see millions of dollars every year because there is organized infrastructure. So we have to build organized infrastructure at this scale. And this is a conceptual way of understanding it. What we're talking about here is bioregional investment platforms, which is to create portfolios of projects organized around landscapes. So you have a landscape like the McKenzie River Basin. And within that landscape are projects, and they're organized into a portfolio. And there's a diversity of projects. There are education projects. There are projects for social welfare. There are projects for fish. There are projects for forest. There are projects for material flows, like timber for construction or whatever it may be. If you create a portfolio of those projects, then you create an investment instrument that is less risky. And so what we're doing in Barichara is we've created a community foundation, a philanthropic organization that mobilizes resources, but you can do it a lot of ways. The idea is to create robust circulation of values within this portfolio, which means the projects collaborate with each other, and you mobilize resources for them as a collection. We've now done 4 rounds of successful fundraising, mobilizing money into Barichara by funding collections of projects organized as landscapes. So it looks like this. The structures of bioregional regeneration is you need to have coherent ecosystems for learning about your story of place. You need to cultivate territorial governance to be able to map out, set priorities, set agendas, allocate resources to make decisions together. And you need to do integrated landscape management. You need to manage at the scale of landscapes. And as you do this, you'll start to create a robust circulation of value flow, which is valuable exchanges begin to occur within and between the parts, and new capacities emerge. Or put in simpler language, you weave the people and projects in a place. You grow the cooperative abilities among them. You deepen their organizing capacities to work together. And then you birth a regenerative economy organized at the landscape scale. This is how to create local living economies. So if you look at something like the river sheds of the Salish Sea, you go, oh wow, we could do that for every one of these. Right? Yeah, you know, the Fraser River is huge, but you could start imagining a project at this scale with a portfolio of projects organized around landscapes. We could do this for every watershed in the Salish Sea. What's interesting about this is if you look at where these watersheds are, and then look at where the language families are of indigenous peoples, you see there's an interesting correspondence. They're not the same. See, if I go back and go, there are the watersheds, here are the language families. They're not the same, but they're broadly corresponding because the geographic range of their economic exchange is bounded by landscape. We work within this main watershed. we have trade along this set of rivers. And so the language families that you see, all of the indigenous people of different tribes who speak the same language family, that means they have a shared history of economic exchange. And it's already organized around landscapes. So this is how we can explain our Regenerate Cascadia tour, and you can start to see the logic of it. And actually, we're not doing this map exactly. This map has changed a little bit, hasn't it? Oh no, it's close. It's close to what we're doing. We keep making little updates. But at the beginning of the week, we were in the Columbia River Gorge. And then we came here to Eugene. And what we're doing is telling the story of how to regenerate Cascadia in every place we go, and then building organizing capacities for each place to continue organizing in this way moving forward and to partner with the other places. And so this has already started in the Columbia River Gorge as of Sunday. It started here in Eugene as of Wednesday. Tomorrow, we travel on to Portland. We're going to be in Portland for a couple of days. Then after Portland, we go to Olympia next week. Then next weekend, we go to Vashon Island, just off of Seattle. And then we go to Seattle. And then we go to Whidbey Island. And then we go, actually, we're going in a different sequence from there. From Whidbey Island, we're going to go to Port Townsend and Fort Worden on the Olympic Peninsula. And then we're going to go to Vancouver Island, based mainly in Victoria. And then we're going to go to Gabriola Island, which is just off of Nanaimo between Vancouver Island and Vancouver. And then we're going to go to Bellingham and Skagit Valley. Now you notice this isn't the whole bioregion, but it's a pretty nice swath to cover in 30 days. So in the span of 1 month, what we're going to do is travel from place to place, working with local organizers in each place to help organize events where we can have this conversation, the same conversation in each place, and then support the organizing within and between the places to continue afterwards. So what we're doing is birthing the process of regenerating Cascadia. And just by being here tonight, you're already part of it. And now while we're doing this at the Cascadia scale, as if that was, not big enough, right? Let's go to a larger scale. Here's North America. Notice how it's conveniently organized around watersheds. Well, back in late January, early February, my partner Penny in there in the back, she and I went to Southern Ontario, to the Greater Takaranto Bioregion, to the Finger Lakes and Genesee River of upstate New York, to the Cuyahoga River in northeastern Ohio, and we did a bioregional activation tour to start a conversation about the regeneration of the Great Lakes. We went back about 6 weeks ago and continued that work. And the Great Lakes are organizing, and there's going to be a summit for the regeneration of the Great Lakes in January. Then, in November last year, December last year, and then again in May and June of this year, we traveled, in May and June, we traveled from the headwaters of the Colorado Basin and the western slopes of the Colorado Rockies to the Sea of Cortez in Mexicali, Mexico, traveling and giving talks in different communities about the regeneration of the Colorado River as a whole. And 2 weeks ago, a gathering of landscape leaders across the Colorado Basin came together to start building strategies and funding and cooperation frameworks for the regeneration of the Colorado Basin. And right now, here we are in Cascadia, activating a sequence of conversations, a mycelial web across Cascadia that can collaborate with the Great Lakes, can collaborate with the Colorado Basin. We also have work happening in the Northern Acadian Forest in Maine. We have work that's happening in Northern Andes in South America, where I live in Barichara. We have work that's starting to emerge in different parts of Europe, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand. We have conversations starting to happen in the Driftless region, which is an upper part of the Mississippi River, and in the Ogallala Aquifer, which is in the western Great Plains. So people are starting to organize the Mississippi River Basin. And you begin to see how to regenerate a continent. It's exactly the same. Organize local places embedded within larger land system patterns, embedded within subcontinental scale tapestries of landscapes, embedded within continents. And this is how we regenerate continents. So you can,
in Canada?
yeah, this is happening in British Columbia and in Ontario now, and we have conversations starting to bubble up in Ottawa and other places. And in this way, we're creating bioregional networks on every continent. We'll give a pass to Antarctica. We got enough to cover without going to the big ice sheet in the south. But you can see that this is something that is starting to happen for real all over the world. And we see Cascadia as having a special role and a special responsibility because this is the oldest, the most established, and the most mature bioregion on Earth. It's also the best known example of a bioregion on Earth because the meme of Cascadia has gotten around, and it's been around for almost half a century. And so we created a design school for regenerating Earth. It started in March. We're just getting started. And so you can see there, people all over the world are gathering to regenerate the Earth at the bioregional scale, organized into a planetary network of learning exchanges between landscapes. The design school is where we're coordinating the learning between bioregions. And we're engaging in these activation tours with local bioregional organizers. And then there's my book, The Design Pathway, that Sean had talked about at the beginning, which tells the story of the design pathway. I've got some copies in the back if you want to get one. You could buy a copy and help pay for our gas for this trip. But also, just by being here tonight, you're already part of the story in this book because we are living out the design pathway right now by organizing in this way. And then there's the Regenerate Cascadia website. And actually, Brandon's got a little sign-up form for anyone who wants to follow along and get involved in Regenerate Cascadia. They're organizing a summit at the end of this process in the beginning of November. It's regeneratecascadia.org. If you go there and look at our calendar of stops in the next few weeks, if you have friends anywhere we're going, you might let them know so they can come and hang out with us, and we can start to weave the thread. And what I'd like to do is, just for a minute, is to invite Brandon up to talk a little bit about Regenerate Cascadia and what's growing here, because Brandon has been part of the Cascadia movement since he was a kid, since he was a wee lad, and he's from Seattle, so he's a Cascadia native, so I'll pass it over to Brandon.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. And maybe let's have a round of applause. So I'm just going to take a minute and talk a little bit about Regenerate Cascadia and also what steps we can be taking right now for the Mackenzie River and the Willamette Valley kind of watershed as a larger area. How do we identify the core leadership teams for this watershed? As part of a Cascadia bioregional network, as part of this planetary network that Joe and Penny are building, this network starts here with the people in this room. To start, there is an email sheet kind of being passed around. If you're interested in getting updates, if you're interested in being a part of this core leadership team, please feel free to put your name and email address. There's also a space for you to add info about any organizations you might be connected with, and also other organizations, communities, organizers that we should know about that maybe aren't already connected. The first goal of this activation team is to gather together these voices. Then this process of bioregional governance and regeneration can begin. And we hope that here in Eugene, that you'll take the opportunity to come together, meet your neighbors, and that sometime in the next month, maybe, or 2 months, another in-person gathering can happen where we really start to have these conversations. Not just here, but as a broader network as part of the Cascadia bioregion. If you want to be involved, the next real steps, you can always find more information at regeneratecascadia.org. The next big event, as Joe was just saying, is going to happen November 3rd through November 12th. And it's going to be an online Cascadia Bioregional Summit. The first weekend will really be for everybody to give presentations. If you're doing amazing work, we want to share that with other people who might not be familiar. We want to connect people together. During the week, we'll have themed conversations each evening, one different theme per night. And then the final weekend will really be about envisioning. And that's coming together as a region to really start to talk about some of the issues that Joe's brought up. And that's creating a shared vision together. It's creating informational commons and bioregional frameworks where we can be starting to assess the inputs, outputs. Are we being successful together? And what those might look like. And then lastly, it's about creating and stewarding a bioregional regeneration fund. And that fund is a fund that can be stewarded by different watershed communities and community leaders at that landscape level as dictated by the landscape leaders themselves. And so how do we shift from these competitive economies and funding ecosystems to collaborative ones where we can be working together? And then how can we be templatizing and making this process replicable for other areas, for the Colorado River Basin, for the Great Lakes, and all of these other things? So if you're interested, please do sign that email sheet. Again, you can go to regeneratecascadia.org. And if you haven't already, please do consider donating. There's a tip jar for Dharmalya for the event space here itself. Please do buy the Design Pathway for Regenerating Earth, which is Joe's book. We're not paid to be here. We're doing this because we believe in it. And so all the funds raised from the book sales and everything, just really, it goes to Joe and Penny. It goes to help cover gas. It goes to help cover food and event costs and rental spaces.
I'm gonna sign up for the design school.
So you can go talk to Jenny, Joe, and Penny afterwards at the back table. And then also, if you're interested in learning more about Cascadia or bioregionalism, please feel free to find me, also at the back table. And then lastly, I think that's about it. I guess I'll just say that through their platform, Joe and Penny are doing an amazing job of helping spread the idea of bioregionalism on a global and planetary scale. But our job is, how do we create Cascadia as a node as part of this interconnected planetary network? How do we organize across Eugene and the Willamette Valley in a way that's equitable, that can fit into a network of watersheds and ecoregions here within Cascadia? How do we map these amazing regenerative projects and communities into all of these different, into a broader tapestry that can empower this work? On a sunny day in July of 1986, more than 100 individuals gathered at Evergreen State College in Olympia. They met deliberatively in a participatory process that included delegates from watersheds, towns, organizations, groups, and species to examine challenges to the region and explore strategies and goals to overcome them. Over that weekend, organizers gathered with what would become the first Cascadia Bioregional Congress. Now, more than 40 years later, we are here in this room asking you the same questions. What would it look like if we stepped up to take responsibility for our watersheds, bioregion, and home? What impact would it have to regenerate the Mackenzie River and the Willamette Valley? How could we come together to regenerate the entire Cascadia bioregion? And we hope you'll join us in answering these questions. And now, Joe will come back up and can help answer any other questions you have. So, yeah.
Do you want to be contacted in the future if we're going to have a meeting a month or 2 months down the line? Does that mean you put your email on that list that's being passed around?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so we have a microphone because Stephen is capturing recordings, and so that's why you don't hear anything, is because this is so that he's capturing it for the audio, because we feel like this tour that we're doing is actually historic, and we hope that it becomes seen that way. This really becomes the beginning of something. And so we're archiving it and going to be posting all the content online, so it'll be available to everyone. So that's why we'll be passing around the mic and why it doesn't seem to work. So I see. So I'd love to open it up for questions. Let's see, there's Cindy here and then Kirsten next, and then we can go from there.
I was just going to ask, are we going to have access to this tape? Because I have so many people I want to send it to.
Yes,
Yeah.
the answer is yes.
That was my question.
Corollary timeline on that. Stephen, do you know how long it'll take?
Well, we're streaming live to YouTube, so it's there when it's on stream.
Yeah, so there's a live version that sometimes comes out a little fuzzy because of bandwidth. So we'll have to look at the quality later, but there will be a recording. And Stephen has a recording on the camera as well. So if it turns out that the fuzzy recording is fuzzy, then we'll just have to basically put the audio from the recordings with the camera and get a better video version. So,
Easy peasy, right, Stephen?
Oh, yeah.
so yeah, but it's really important to archive this and share it. We already have some recordings from Columbia River Gorge that are online. The one from last night, unfortunately, went funny because there was poor bandwidth at Lost Valley. But the idea is to archive this as we go. So are there any questions or comments that anyone has, please? And whoa, that light is bright. Ooh.
Thank you, Joe. Really like the presentation. Can understand from the land how a watershed, like things can be divided up by a watershed. I'm less certain about how a bioregion is formed. Do you think people might argue over that? And why would you use a bioregion over a watershed to, set those areas up?
I would maybe start by saying I would do both, or I would encourage both. I would encourage watersheds to set up their own watershed management. And then I would say that bioregions must be politically contested. So I would actually invite that debate. I would insist on it. I would say if anyone comes along, like for those of you who don't know, there's an organization called One Earth, oneearth.org, and they say a map of bioregions, and they're strictly defined by ecoregions as if humans don't exist, and as if culture, economics, and politics don't exist. And I think that is a huge error, even to project that falsehood. What I actually think we need to do is create public, think of like town hall debates, like genuine political debate about what the bioregion is. And Brandon has comments on that. Probably lots of comments. And you can have more with local beer.
I'll keep it really short, but I would just respond that I think in response, one of the really nice things about the Cascadia bioregion is you'll see that is a map of watersheds. And so they serve as this really nice fundamental building block. But within that, I think if you start to look and examine at how humans have structured themselves, I think we alter our landscapes at a rate that's unprecedented. And so we need to be taking that into account. And if you look at, from Eugene up to Vancouver, BC in this tour, it's 80% of the entire population of the people living in all of those watersheds together live in this little teeny corridor. And we cross watersheds. And so that's why I think this discussion is both, we start with the watersheds and these really hard geologic tectonic lines, and then we build up to the soft, and then finally it's the human geography and layers. But I think the difference of a bioregional map as opposed to, say, a nation-state map is that rather than just drawing a set of lines arbitrarily, it's bioregional maps emerge from layers, and it's layer after layer after layer after layer. It's salmon, it's wildfires, it's human geography, it's indigenous cultures, it's indigenous language groups, it's settler patterns, it's rainfall, windfall. All of those coming together helps a bioregion emerge, and we can work together on those different layers, and we will necessarily have different frameworks for each of those, whether that conversation is salmon or whether it's watershed restoration. So maybe that just helps a little bit.
Yeah, over to Christine.
Can people say their names too when they speak?
Sure. I'm Christine Lorenz. I live in Eugene, and I've thrown my hat into the ring this last month. When you said it's not political, if you're working with Canadian areas and U.S. areas, and we want to combine, make change, think of all those things that were on the circle, raising funds, everything, do we need to have political agreement?
I would say you need to have political agreement at the level of how a commons functions. We could have a whole conversation about Eleanor Ostrom and what she discovered and how humans actually are quite good at managing commons. But one of the key pieces of a commons is shared identity and purpose. And so that's why I use the example of, do we want salmon in this river, is a question about identity and purpose. It's not just a question of purpose, because not everyone identifies with that purpose. And so the identity and purpose are together. And one of the nice political science words is polity. Polity is a cohesive political identity and system, like the polity of the Roman Empire. And so that concept of a coherent political entity, like a political collective, in a commons, it's the shared identity and purpose. In other forms of governance, it might be something else. So like in an oligarchy, then the polity is defined by particular power structures. And so what's beautiful about the commons-based, the design aspects of the commons, is that shared identity and purpose become really fundamental. And so what I would say is, it's impossible for this to not be political. That's just never going to not be political. But the ways that it's political are also going to be varied. So the question of whether we have salmon in a particular river is a pretty clearly political question. But if we ask the question, what's the relationship of this bioregional movement to the United States, that's a different political question. And so but it's obviously relevant, which is to say it is political. And so what I think is really important about this is to see how our current systems are killing themselves and that they have a shelf life and that there will be a time when they don't exist anymore. And for those of you who don't know the history, 90% of our nation states were created in the 20th century. It's like 100 years old or less. And many of them, if you look at the maps, they just keep shuffling. Is it the Czech Republic? Is it Czechoslovakia? It depends on the moment that the political boundaries were drawn. And so nation states are impressively ephemeral, but they seem really stable and long-lasting at the moment. And so it's just to recognize that humans reinvent their political structures on a continual basis. And what's happening now is a massive breakdown of a globalized system because it's inherently unsustainable. And so the question becomes, how does governance work in a time like this? And one of the key things is to return it to local, because local is where you either have food or you don't, if you don't have global supply chains. Local is where you have drinkable water or you don't, if you don't have global supply chains. And so local becomes really important, but local defined too small becomes ineffective. It just becomes competitive. It becomes prepper. It becomes, well, I'm going to get mine and screw everyone else, which leads to everyone dying because it doesn't actually work.
Do you ever invite, do you ever invite local political on the level of, like in Oregon, are, very sympathetic, who just retired? DeFazio and our Senator Wyden, my brain, I'm sorry, and other local commissioners, et cetera, to let them know about our movement as it develops and support us, or is that off?
Well, I'll give a couple of examples where it's very context specific. So I'll give a couple examples. When we started working in Toronto, what that meant was there was a local group that lives in Toronto that's been working there for a long time. And so we didn't come in as outsiders to work with Toronto. We worked with local organizers. They were already connected to a person who's an ambassador for them, which is a man named David Crombie, who's a former mayor of Toronto, who he commissioned a report in 1992 called Regenerate, where he defined the bioregion around the Oak Ridges Moraine and the drainages of southern Ontario. So he had a bioregional framework that was created that was meant to guide the creation of what's this world-famous Greenbelt of Toronto, the conservation authorities that are organized around watersheds, and other large-scale structures of Ontario. So there's an elder statesman who's a former mayor. And that's an example. Another example is I'm friends with people like Richard Conlon, who's a co-founder of Sustainable Seattle and a former city council member in Seattle. And I'm going to be meeting with him when we go to Whidbey Island. And so the way I would say it is we don't seek out political entities. We engage and welcome conversations with individuals. And they bring whatever affiliations they have. And one thing that's interesting is Penny and I were in a conversation last year with a friend of ours named Christopher Life, who works with the leaders of all the independent political parties in the United States. Because it's an interesting little fact that if you aggregate all of the independent parties, they represent more than half of the voting public. But because they're third parties in a two-party winner-take-all system, they disappear from elections. And so you have Democrats, Republicans, and everyone else. But if you look at voter turnout, the majority of people don't vote. And so they started a conversation with the heads, the leaders of the independent parties, to say, well, if you guys want to have a vote of no confidence against the two-party system, it'd be very interesting to promote a bioregional framework, which is your own local organizing that's different from cities and states and nations. And so there are really interesting back channels, but it's always with people, not organizations. Okay. It's like to go to the city of Eugene and have this conversation is just premature. Right? It's like, who? For what? By whom? But if you start forming a coalition and a strong capacity, and then you're talking to someone who's in the city, like in the transportation office, who already aligns with walkable bike infrastructure or whatever it may be, you talk to them as a person. And then you build them. Movements are built by people. Okay. And so the political aspect is very much who are you talking to, in which context, for which purpose. And so the political dimension is being politically savvy. But it's not that it's not there. It's very much there. I'm sure many of you know people who are in elected positions. And so, or they're employees of governments. Like, I'm friends with someone who used to work at the Oregon Water Resources Department, a government, public sector employee. So there are various ways that this plays out. But yeah, that's where it's hard to have a single conversation because it's very context specific. Yeah. Are there any other questions, Sean?
I just follow up with Christine's question. I sent invitations to the mayor and city council and the commissioners and eWeb and others. Look around you. They're not in enough pain yet, but they're going to be very soon. So that conversation will happen.
Yeah. So are there any other questions, please? And what's your name?
Alex.
Alex, nice to meet you.
Hi. So you mentioned, I think, secession earlier.
Yeah,
Will this be after the death of the federal government? And how do you prevent corruption?
Well, the way you prevent corruption is by building effective governance. That's the generic answer. One of the beautiful things about commons-based management is that it leads to a thing called polycentric governance, which is many centers of decisions and cooperation between them, which is just to say there are very powerful ways of governing that work. For those of you who are familiar with sociocracy as a facilitation approach, which is to create small groups, each of which has specific focus and has coordination among them, which means there's communication between them or mutual representation where a member of one can be a member of another. And then you create organizational charts, like the people in the communication group are talking to the people that are in the group that's organizing catering for an event, and there's communication between them. There are lots of examples like this where governance works. And one of the key things for us in this time, which is actually one of the topics that doesn't get talked about nearly enough, is data sovereignty. Because we're in a world of data. There's so much data. So I just want to name data sovereignty for a moment to give an example of where we could build this kind of governance. So some of you might have heard of cryptocurrencies and blockchains and these things. Some of you may scratch your head and wonder what those things are. But basically, I want to tell a historical anecdote and then move forward, which is that in 1470, in Venice, there was a major trade hub for ships that would leave the port of Venice and travel all over the world for the colonial empires. And in 1470, they created a new accounting tool called double entry accounting, which is your profits and loss sheets. This double entry accounting allowed for multiple investors to put money into the same entity and track expenses and manage risks, which is why in 1499, the first joint stock company was created and the age of corporations was born. Which is to say, the way that you structure accounting shapes the kinds of management you can do and the kinds of organizations you can create. That's just a little historical anecdote, but a very important one. So blockchain was created, and blockchain's one set of technologies. It's got lots of problems, so I don't want to hold it up as a tool that solves all problems. But what's interesting about blockchain is blockchain allows you to verify something happened without a middleman. So, which is to say there are technological tools. Blockchain is one set of them, but there are technological tools that allow you to verify that something happened without a middleman. Where might this be important? Let's say you have a local farm and you go to the farmer's market and you want to be certified organic. Who certifies you? A $10,000 process and a middleman. Because you don't have a way to simply verify the data that shows the way that you handle your chickens or the way you handle your soil or the way you handle your fruit trees. But if you have data that verifies your practices and you have a way of tracking that data as an accounting system, then you don't need a middleman to verify it. It changes certification fundamentally. And you can see how this relates to certifying whether a vote occurs or other such things that are important in governing systems. I bring this up because data sovereignty is about who controls and who has access and who can allocate rights to use data. So one of the underlying pieces of this conversation is how do we create our own accounting systems? Because a big part of dealing with corruption is having good books, is having good accounting systems. This is one part. There's plenty more, but this is just one domain that's really, really important. And what's happening right now in a world called Web 3, because Web 1 was connect your computer to a networked system. Web 2 was that you have platforms that you can create content on that are networked, but someone else owns it. Like, Mark Zuckerberg owns Facebook and he owns your data, but you can post on Facebook. Web 3 is where you own and manage and control the development of your own technology and your own data in a decentralized way. So Web 3 is the creation of tools for decentralized ownership and governance, which is where the crypto and the other things are interesting, even though a lot of these fake monies are fake monies. And so it's like, oh, Bitcoin seems like to be another Ponzi scheme. Well, it mostly is. But some of the tools are data tracking and accounting tools. So this is there's a whole conversation to be had here. I'm just touching on a couple of elements. But it's to say that there are currently millions of people all over the world working to create decentralized governance tools and decentralized financing tools, which is called ReFi, or regenerative finance, or DeFi, which is decentralized finance. And they're all in the same world of tool builders. There are millions of them out in the world. Most of them don't work very well. But if you think of the dial-up days of dial-up modems and the internet, there was a period of time when the internet didn't work very well. And so what we're seeing is that very quickly, there will be a lot of very powerful governing tools that will allow us to manage corruption in fundamentally different ways so that we can scale governance and still manage corruption. And so notice that's a placeholder for many conversations, because to say how do we manage corruption is many conversations. But one of the pieces that's really different is the technology tools we have for data. And so this is a big deal. If you do something like, if you fly a drone over a watershed to track reforestation, and you have sensors on that drone that are tracking canopy cover and calculating proxies for carbon sequestration to unlock carbon credits to deliver funding for future reforestation projects, that can now be done with a data management system without certification. And so it's things like this that make all of this very interesting. It's very interesting because we can invent new tools of governance. And we can invent new tools of data tracking and monitoring. And so this is all just to say that we're in a very interesting time of breakdown and collapse, but also a very interesting time of new toys. The question of corruption remains vigilant. Is that it's just brought up in every place that it's relevant, because it's going to come up over and over again. Is that good for now? Because it's a huge topic.
I tend to go big picture.
Awesome. I really approve. Here in the back.
This is really attractive because it's kind of under the radar organizing at the very literal grassroots level. My brain keeps going to the timber industry and the grass seed industry, which are the moneyed interests in our bioregion. And so what is your assumptions about how that interaction with those economic blocks plays out as we try to make a healthy bioregion against their interests?
One thing is that as human beings, there actually are shared interests. So that's one point. And there's actually a really, really good documentary that was created called Seeing the Forest. I think you can find it on Vimeo, Seeing the Forest, which is a story about the Sayusla, Weyerhaeuser, and environmental groups in the 80s and 90s, where there were logging roads going in, and there was flooding happening, and the logging companies started to see that the way they were managing the destruction of the forest was also hurting their business and hurting the livelihoods of their employees, not just the economic bottom line. And Seeing the Forest is a story of a commons-based framework emerging where unexpected allies came together and created shared solutions, which this is during the time of the spotted owl and the most intense conflicts. Like the poster child of environmental activists fighting against corporations. During that time, almost no one knows that a collaborative framework emerged between Weyerhaeuser and environmental activists in Oregon. And it was around the management of the forest and the water. And so it's just to say that At a human scale, there are different ways that emerge. And so that's just the surprising reality of this, is that they may not be as much of a blockade as they seem, depending on the scale we look at and the time frames we look at. Now that said, there are obvious blockades and opposition now and in the past as well. So I'm not meaning to dismiss that. So the way I would begin to address that is to say that there's a very obvious pattern when a civilization is beginning to collapse. It actually comes from the work of a man named Peter Turchin. He's a cultural evolution researcher at the University of Connecticut. And he studies the collapse of civilizations through a specific lens. He studies it through population statistics as an evolutionary biologist. And he looks at the creation of elite positions within the economy. And what he found was the precursor signal of collapse for any empire or civilization is the overproduction of elites. Which is that there are only so many positions for elites, but you produce too many people to fill those positions, and the elite structures of control break down. And so an example of this, university professors. How many university positions are there, and how many people get PhDs every year? We're way overproducing elites. So that's an example of an overproduction of elites. When this happens, the coherence of the power control of those highly unequal societies, their coherence breaks down. And this is before civil unrest. It's before civil unrest. It's a precursor signal. We have been in elite overproduction in the US and in the global system since about 1980, which means the whole system is about to topple itself. Now, there are plenty of other measures. You know, I showed that slide at the beginning of tipping points in the Earth system. Didn't talk about tipping points in social systems, but this is an example of a tipping point in social systems. So what happens when your entire industry collapses? I'll give an example. In the 90s, one of the largest and most financially viable fisheries in the world was in Maine, in the Gulf of Maine. Because the Gulf of Maine has lobster and big game fish. It's a multi-billion-dollar per year industry. Just as a little Earth systems fact, the Gulf of Maine is also the fastest heating part of the world's ocean. It's already heated by more than 5 degrees Celsius since 1980. And it's because ice melting from Greenland is disrupting the mixing where the cold water from the Arctic can no longer come south and the Atlantic warm water is coming in addition to all the other warming factors. In the 90s, the fishery ecosystem and the economy of the Gulf of Maine completely collapsed. It went from multiple billions of dollars a year to bankruptcy of all the fishing companies. What they began to do was a conservation and economic development multi-stakeholder process to re-envision sustainable fisheries. Now, are those sustainable fisheries what we really need for the future? Maybe not. But are they way better than what came before? Hell yes. And so when you start to see the collapse of industries, like what happened in Detroit with the automotive industry, or in St. Louis with the shipping industry, with the collapse of industrialism, what you start to see is the possibility of renaissance or further fragmentation and cascading breakdowns. And so the key to building a strong regional economy here, as the current one breaks down, is to create the network relationships of people that can reconfigure the parts to salvage some of them as functions as the system goes down. So if you look at the lumber industry as a logistics system, it's pretty awesome. They're effective at logistics. If you look at the shipping industry and the ports, they're frickin' amazing at what they do. Are they doing it for an extractive economy? Hell yes. And so when you start to look at them as functions and capacities, then you start to see different ways of playing with them, but they have to break down enough. Until they collapse enough, you can't change them. And just like the Soviet Union was the world superpower one day and a line of vodka in the streets the next, is that they're only strong until they're not strong, and the changes tend to happen fast. Breakdown tends to be cascades. So it's just to say that we can safely predict that those economies will not be strong for very much longer. And then what do we do about it is about the preconditions, the relationships that are present when the breakdowns occur. But yeah, that's another huge topic. So down here and then up there.
Is it cool if I respond to that
Please,
too?
yeah.
So I'm part of a group called the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance, which is a giant collaboration of some of the largest land defense organizations and grassroots land defense activists in the Pacific Northwest, from Ferry Creek down to Humboldt. And then we have a really large presence in both Oregon and Washington. And we've been studying with the lead of a group called the Coast Range Association, Joe, if you've ever heard of them, studying land ownership maps and the forest industry, and basically how the entire economic structure of forestry in Oregon and Washington works. And a couple of basic facts about this that are kind of scary in relationship to this idea that the industry is going to collapse is that almost 50% of forestry corporations on private forest lands are now owned by real estate investment trusts, and their primary economic future is carbon credits and the complete liquidation of the Coast Range. So what their goal, there was just a conference in Portland at the zoo at the World Forestry Center that we protested that was called Who Will Own the Forest? And it is a gathering of the world's most powerful real estate investment corporations and timber organizations to understand how to buy up all of the forests in the Pacific Northwest that are available so that they can jump into the carbon credit market. And the issue with that economy is that it's based on liquidation, right? It's these people are investor class from outside of Oregon. So none of the money that is a part of their economics is coming back to Oregon at all. So like it'd be better to have Weyerhaeuser, right, if non-public, at least doing this stuff, because then they're paying people in Oregon, even if they're mechanized. But so the entire economic logic of forestry in Oregon right now is just to shorten rotations as much as possible, liquidate as fast as possible to pay off these investors before they die, because timber crops are 40-year rotations at their shortest, and that's ecologically genocidal already. And the point that I'm making is that there's a coalition built around the Coast Range Association to direct everyone to community forestry. Like the goal is the transition of private forestry in Oregon to community forestry, and then just like a basic, sane, ecological management structure for public forest lands. But that's only possible if we can counter the propaganda of the timber industry right now. And I only go into this because forests are our most important resource in Cascadia, right? We are the most biologically dense ecosystems on the planet. There's more biomatter. There should be more biomatter in our forests than any place on Earth, but that's if we're at 2,000-year forests with 400-foot canopies, and instead we're plantation ecology. And so if we were to transition our forests, just our forest lands, which are horribly managed, I mean, if you look at the stuff in the last 15 years, it's worse than it was in the 90s. They're not cutting as much, but their practices are just as bad, and there's not enough of it left for the rationality of what they're cutting. So anyway, it's an important fight here in Cascadia, and you brought it up, so I figured that I would plug the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance because, I don't know if you're in it already, but we're doing the work. Look it up and sign up, and there's a big coalition. There's multiple timber sales that we're defending, and we are doing the work to deal with the propaganda narrative that the timber industry has created. And there's a couple leverage points in the next few years that will allow us to actually get wins, but the timber industry is on the offensive because they've won the propaganda narrative with fire and thinning and carbon credits, making people just believe that they are the solution to climate change. I mean, they're clear-cutting forests and saying that their new plantations they plant are net carbon positive and then buying carbon credits with them. So anyway, it's a good solution, and I feel like there are answers coming up the pipeline.
What I love about this topic, and I know we're going to come over here, is you can see why bioregional governance would really make a difference for a conversation like this. Instead of it feeling like a mostly powerless conversation or who's already organizing, is how do we build that governing capacity, which is a process in its own right. So thanks for bringing that up.
My name's Chris, and I'm curious about whether there are some fundamental ground rules about what proportion of what types of people are best at accomplishing these goals? Are there certain ratios of interests of lay people compared to professionals, ecologists compared to economists, indigenous compared to industrialists, just for instance? Or is there really room at the table for everyone to collaborate in this and still come out with net positives, win-wins all the way around? In other words, how do we bring the greatest diversity of voices to the table and convince them that a shared benefit is not only at stake, but is possible?
This is a really good question. And I want to start with one important piece of information, which is that humans have been an ecological overshoot since the mid-1970s, which means the human population is way too large at a planetary scale. And it's coming down one way or the other. And so it's just recognizing that the human population is already too large. So this isn't about 8 billion humans in a sustainable pattern on Earth, which is, just look at the ecological footprint. And you either have lower consumption or lower population, but either way it's per capita, what's called ecological load, the amount of per capita contribution, and the regenerative capacities, and there's a balance between. That's how the ecological footprint works. So it's just a comment that the population's already too large at a planetary scale, and I'm confident it's too large at a bioregional scale. So it's just an acknowledgement that we're in a predicament. So, which is to say there's no simple answers because we're in a predicament. It's a wicked problem and it's a predicament. Now that said, what I've discovered in practice is that almost no one gets this. Almost no one is going to change their lives. And also almost no one is going to be devoted enough to do the difficult work of doing this. So statistically speaking, it's going to be really small anyway. This is what I found in practice. Is that every example of every civilization that's ever collapsed, you didn't have everyone wake up and get it and stop it. There's 0 examples of that. That doesn't happen. So there's another version of this, which is that the main obstacle we have right now is our own internal traumas and our abilities to be in relationship with each other. This is a fundamental issue. It's a fundamental issue. And so it's less about which ethnographic group someone's from, or which background in terms of intellectual or knowledge or profession. So those kinds of compositional numbers, those demographic kinds of numbers, are less important for this. What's more important is connection, belonging, and devotion. And it turns out these are things that are really hard to create, really hard to fake, and really not very common. And Penny and I talk about this a lot, about how few people are devoted and what it means for people to be devoted. And so we're in a time that is of, I would say, the most important dimension of everything we talked about tonight is the spiritual dimension. By spiritual, I just mean larger than self, but you can look at it in lots of ways. But do I care more for the survival of this forest, even if I die? Or do I know that I'm going to die anyway, and I don't know how long I've got, so I need to stop thinking about that and stop caring about my own security? I may still live a long time, but maybe I don't care about my security. Whereas a lot of people are like, I'm anxious, let me try and hoard my money. Right? You see, it's really different. But this is spiritual. This is inner development. This is inner development. And that means that there's a really big role for a category or an archetype of people in this work that doesn't normally get talked about. Which is one of the most important roles in this is not the people that plant the trees or grow the soils or grow the food, although all those people are actually subsets of this category. Because all of those people are healers in some way. And there's work for the healers. So much of this is about who is being fully human and who is capable of being in relationship. Because being fully human is in relationship with more than humans. Like being in relationship is the ability to feel the river. right? Being fully human is belonging somewhere. I have a really profound question that I ask people to see if they know where they belong. When you die, do you know where you will gift your bones back to the earth? Most people cannot answer this question. We're on loan from the earth. Every part of my body is minerals and materials of the earth. They will be given back. If I know where I'm going to give my bones, I know where I belong. So one of the most important things in this work to figure out how many it will be is to figure out how many people know where to bury their bones. So there are these really interesting surprises in this conversation. And one of the surprises is that most people aren't going to make it. And actually, all of us are going to be dead before it's done anyway, because it's longer than a human lifespan. We're talking about something that's probably 200 to 500 years. What Sean was talking about with 400-foot canopies, longer. But just to get it on course, 200 to 500 years, during the worst collapse and the worst threat to humans as a species that we've ever experienced. Now, there are a couple of bottlenecks in the past where the human population dropped to like 7,000, 8,000 individuals. One about 80,000 years ago, another 150,000 years ago. That's one of the arguments for the universal psychology of humans, which is that all humans are basically fundamentally similar and human nature is shared. It's the anti-racism argument. Black people aren't dumber than white people, et cetera, et cetera. We have universal psychology because, for one reason, our genetics are so similar from the gene pool of two big bottlenecks that happened during the last ice age. But what's interesting about this is that that fundamental human psychology is able to empathize with the rivers and with other life. And so much of this is about education of children for that reason. So much of this is about who needs to have the conscience and perspective to carry through what's coming. And most of them are below the age of 30 right now. Because of what's coming, the worst of it's coming in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. So for those of you who are older like me, I'm not that old, I'm about to turn 47, but I'm old enough that I was during this time when we would talk about what's going to happen by 2050. 2050 was this weird abstraction. My daughter was born in 2017. So 2050 is when my daughter is 33. So now I have a way of imagining 2050. My daughter is about to turn 7, and I can imagine her in her early 30s. And I can imagine what's my daughter in her early 30s going to be living through, and then I think about 2050. And I'm like, well, first of all, there's a pretty good chance my daughter's not going to live to 2050. But if she does, did I prepare her? That's why I care so much about the children's education. And so it's this way of thinking, this ability to move backward and forward in time and to be devoted. This is what matters most, more than numbers. Because there's no way to know the power of the numbers of the devoted. Because the devoted are fucking powerful. And so it's really different. The calculus is different when we think this way. And I know people here are devoted. You know, Jan, who was sitting here 23 years doing permaculture in his house, can't tell me that's not devoted. And so they're devoted. And one of the challenges for us is not necessarily to cultivate the devoted, but to help the devoted find each other and to bring capacities to them. And one of the capacities is for them to help heal themselves and to heal others. Because what we need is more humans that are healed, or at least healing enough, right? Because what's going to happen? The shit hits the fan. I go back to hitting the juice. I become angry. I beat someone. They hit me over the head with a crowbar. Game over. The trauma patterns are fundamental. They're fundamental. And there's another thing that's really interesting in all of this, which is that, I just want to name this, and this might be a good way for us to come to close, because I think we now have a lot to process. But something to bring us to close is that we are not trying to go backward to something that happened before. This is really important. You know, there's this thing called the noble savage, which is basically insert ridiculous fake stereotype of indigenous people as better humans somehow. It's like absurd. Anthropologists used to believe it for a little while, then they realized that it was a dumb idea too, and they moved on. And now there are these historical times where you look at someone from the 1930s and go, that person was college educated? And there's this idea of the idealized indigenous. Just want to name one thing really clearly. All indigenous people are human. They're messy, complex people just like everyone else. Number two, every one of us here today, we're all descendants of indigenous people, because 99% of human history was only indigenous people. So those of us who don't know our indigenous roots are lost children of some indigenous tribe. I say this because where we're going in the future to be bioregional is indigenous, but it's not the indigenous of the past. Almost everything we know about the indigenous people is from studies during the Holocene, this 11,800 year period of warm, stable climate. Guess what? The Holocene's over. We don't know what's going to work and be sustainable in human cultures outside of the Holocene. All of those studies of hunter-gatherers, it all took place during the Holocene. So when I talk to the really spiritually mature and deeply capable indigenous people, the leaders, the wisdom holders, when I talk to them, what they say is we need the best of science. We need satellites circling the Earth. We need computer models studying the ocean. This is the indigenous. But you know what else we need? We need the ritual and the ceremony that connects us back to right relationship. And so the world we're going to, the future indigenous, is the first time that indigenous people had to be planetary. Imagine indigenous people who are planetary. The indigenous people of Earth and the otter. The indigenous people of Earth and the salmon. This has never had to happen before. This is new. And we need the lost children who went off into modernity, who were born into settler cultures. They created things. We created things that our indigenous brothers and sisters need. The Kogis, which is an indigenous tribe from the Tairona civilization, that's in Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta in Colombia, which they call the heart of the world, where there's a mountain that at the base is white sands in the Caribbean, and at the top is snow-peak glaciers at the tropics, at the equator. They say that we're entering the third world. For them, the third world is this. The first world is the ancestral traditions and wisdom practices of ancestral humans. This is the life ways of the indigenous people. The second world is modernity and science and technology and globalism. The third world is the best of the first two, and no one has been in it before. No one. So yes, look to our indigenous brothers and sisters, but don't look to them in a way that diminishes us as their fellow human beings. Because we're all human beings. And where we're going, no one's gone before. So what I want to invite is I want you to be welcomed into the regeneration of Cascadia. To say this is a path walked together, and the best way to walk it with us is simply to talk to each other and organize locally, to connect with your friends in other parts of the bioregion, and to be on the email list for Regenerate Cascadia to participate in these future activities and co-create them. This is it. And be devoted. Yeah, Quinn.
So this Sunday in Portland, we're going to have a super cool event on the next part of this tour. And we're all in the Willamette Valley. So if any of y'all could make it and kind of stimulate that cross-pollination, it would be great to see some of y'all there. And you can find more info on the website.
Yeah, regeneratecascadia.org. Yeah.
And yeah, just looking forward to doing some of this organizing with y'all in the future. And Kirsten's another one of our Portland organizers, and Sean's done some with us too.
So with that, thank you, everyone. chat in the back if anyone wants to chat or if wants to copy my book. And we got a sign-up sheet for Regenerate Cascadia back there if you didn't get on it. And you should definitely hit up Brandon with any questions.